Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Q&A session on the year-round deed restriction feasibility study that was sent out through the CDP's housing e-newsletter in December. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Community Development Partnership. For the very few of you who may not be aware of who we are your local community development corporation. We're a nonprofit serving the year-round residents of the Lower and Outer Cape, helping folks live, work, and thrive in the 8 towns that we serve. This Q&A session is part of our Lower Cape Housing Institute. And if you're not familiar, the Housing Institute is an educational opportunity for elected and appointed town officials and town staff to advance housing production strategies in the Lower and Outer Cape. We commissioned this study through Barrett Planning Group, who is going to be providing a presentation today, in response to a lot of feedback that we received, probably from all of you looking back at me right now. Some buzz started through the Cape Cod Commission, and then we got a lot of questions over the past 12 to 18 months of people interested in learning more about year-round deed restrictions. And so we were able to contract with Barrett Planning Group to figure out if this is a solution that actually makes sense for the Lower and Outer Cape. I do want to emphasize that the CDP is really focused on the 8 towns of the Lower and Outer Cape. And so the analysis that you'll see here, we think is most applicable to the region that we serve. It might have different applicability to the rest of the Cape. And so we should keep an open mind around that. Our agenda today is that we're going to hand it over to the Cape Cod Commission first, give us a little overview of why this strategy is in their Regional Housing Strategies report. And then, Will and Alexis from Barrett Planning Group will get into the nitty-gritty about the study. We did receive a ton of excellent questions over the past week. Thank you so much. Speakers have been trying really hard to incorporate those responses into their presentations. I'm sure there will be questions that don't get answered by the end of the session. This recording will be emailed out to all of you so you can reference back to it. You can ask questions in the chat. We'll try to field them as best we can, but if there's any questions that we don't get to, we'll just follow up with you after this session. And I think we can get started. With that, I'll hand it over to Chloe Schaefer from the Cape Cod Commission.
Great, thanks, Andrea, and great to see all of you here. I think I know many of you. My name is Chloe Schaefer. I'm the Chief Planner at the Cape Cod Commission, and hopefully you're seeing my slides now. So we released the Regional Housing Strategy in May of last year, 2024, and it was really probably a year and a half long planning process. And the purpose of it really is to address our housing supply, affordability, and availability challenges, while also protecting our sensitive resources. And the Regional Housing Strategy, as well as perhaps even more importantly now, its implementation is really grounded in these 8 guiding principles, which include generating a greater variety of housing. Certainly, we know we're lacking in many different options in the region. Supporting the year-round population, which I think is really probably most relevant for today's discussion, understanding that especially with our seasonal workforce and their needs, there's really even more pressure and acute challenges facing our year-round residents. And so looking to how we can support them, but also recognizing, again, that we need to protect our natural and cultural resources, addressing climate change and coastal resiliency, coordinating housing and infrastructure projects as we move forward so that as we're addressing our housing challenges, we aren't exacerbating any of the other challenges our region is facing. Additionally, it looks to prioritize redevelopment, given the limited land available still in the region for development or conservation. Looking to regionalize efforts to support municipalities, which is also, again, very relevant, I think, here today, and certainly building support for housing through education we know is going to be crucial in advancing any housing initiatives in the region. And probably none of this is news to you all, but some of the key findings of the housing strategy that really drove its recommendations are the fact that around 80% of our homes are detached single-family homes. So getting back to that, generating greater diversity in housing choices, really stemming from the fact that there aren't a lot of different options in the region now. Certainly, housing is extremely expensive, especially since the pandemic, seeing just a dramatic increase in the price of homes in the region. And certainly wages and incomes are not keeping up with that. We know that short-term rentals also put pressure on our year-round housing stock, with average short-term rents exceeding average year-round rental income in just 2 months regionally, but we know that certainly in many of our communities, especially the more seasonal ones on the lower and outer Cape, that can be an even shorter amount of time. And so the strategy outlines 13 different regional recommendations, and I'm not going to get into all of those, but they do include things like changing zoning, ensuring that different types of housing can be built by right in appropriate areas throughout our region, helping to alleviate the permitting processes there. Also looking to streamline permitting as well, kind of goes hand in hand with that. Something we've been spending a lot of time on recently is looking at potentially establishing a community land trust and regional housing land bank. But what we're here really, I think, to talk about today is that providing financial incentives to convert and preserve year-round housing. And so this recommendation gets at the fact that much of our housing, over a third regionally, and again, that proportion is much higher in many of our lower and outer Cape communities, are used seasonally or as second homes. And that we know that there's a great financial incentive to either rent it out as a short-term rental as opposed to a year-round rental. So really looking at ways that we could incentivize converting those seasonal second homes or short-term rentals to year-round housing, but also looking to preserve the year-round housing that we have today, and that is really critical already. And so one of the next steps outlined in the regional housing strategy is looking to gather data on our current landscape in terms of short-term rentals, as well as our housing market generally, and really to understand kind of what incentives would be enticing to property owners. And certainly this report by the CDP is a great start for the lower and outer Cape towns on that. And I'll just point out briefly, and you're gonna hear more about this, but one of the reasons this is a recommendation in our housing strategies, because we have seen it done elsewhere, especially in many seasonal communities out west, many ski towns that are facing similar challenges in terms of a seasonal housing stock, a discrepancy in terms of what jobs pay and how much housing is costing. So something that we saw in our research as we were looking at strategies throughout the country to help address some of our challenges here, thinking about what might be applicable. We have a fact sheet that provides a brief overview on both occupancy, being year-round occupancy or employment-based deed restrictions, and some examples there. And then to help support towns if they want to move forward with providing year-round occupancy or employment deed restrictions, we do have a model deed restriction we developed to support a model bylaw that also works to incentivize year-round housing, both available on our website. And I think one of the kind of prime examples of this program is the Veil and Deed program, and probably many of you heard George Ruther, who was the Town of Vail's housing director, speaking about this program at our One Cape Summit, which also really helped to spur, I think, interest in this idea and looking to understand how it might be applicable in our region. So these resources, more information, all available on our website. And with that, I will hand it back to Andrea.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, I just realized I was muted the whole time I was
Oh.
speaking. Sorry about that.
No problem. All right. So, hi, everyone. My name is Will Downie. I am a senior planner with Barrett Planning Group, joined here with my colleague Alexis, who I think most of you know in one way or another. And we, as Andrea so generally said, introduced us as we are the group that did the actual study that we are kind of talking about today, that I think hopefully people have been reading. And so we just wanted to give a little bit of a presentation on some of the highlights from what we saw to kind of set the tone. And then mostly we want to allow this to have some time to answer your questions about the report, about what we've learned. And I know a lot of you submitted questions where we can. We've tried to incorporate those into the presentation, but please feel free to ask any of those questions later too, and we're happy to answer. So just to overview what we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk a little bit about setting the tone of what the original project goal was, talking about some of the key findings from the case study communities, and then Alexis is going to talk to us a little bit about turning what we found from the case studies into a Cape Cod context, and then we're going to end with a little bit of discussion about the policy considerations if you're interested in implementing a program like this. So first of all, to just kind of establish where we started, the goal of this project when we worked with CDP was threefold. We wanted to identify and study the existing year-round deed restriction programs across the country. We wanted to model what a similar program could look like on the Lower and Outer Cape. And we wanted to determine the impact and feasibility compared to other programming options. So as you're reading through the report, that is really the focus on what we were doing. And that's maybe why it's structured some of those ways. And that was really shaping both our analysis and the conclusions we came to in the report. So first, jumping into the talk about existing programs, I think we can jump into the next slide. We studied 8 different programs from 7 different communities. Most of them were Western outdoor recreation communities, especially as Chloe said, they tended to be concentrated in kind of Colorado and in those ski communities. Several of them were based on that I-70 corridor stretching west of Denver. You've got your Vails, your Avons, your Breckenridges. But there were also some other programs out in Big Sky, Montana, which is both a ski community from Big Sky and the access to Yellowstone National Parks. And then Placer County, which is actually the northern portion of Lake Tahoe. So again, those ski communities, those recreation communities, that do share some similarities with the Cape. But one thing that we wanted to highlight is a lot of these communities, there was a bit of a difference in the housing variety and the housing types. There were a lot more condominiums, there were a lot more multifamily in a lot of these communities than you might see on some of the towns in Cape Cod. And there were also fewer retiree households. A lot of these were a little bit younger, driven by kind of those active recreation sports like skiing and things like that. And so a lot of these programs that we were looking at, as we're walking through some of these things, these programs, I just want to hedge from the start, these programs were making decisions on these programs based on what their goals were. And these were not a homogeneous program. As I think sometimes it gets discussed, these were really a set of decision policies that we want to really walk you through as part of this presentation. So the first decision was the types of eligible households. There were largely 2 different groups. The first was what we call pure residency, which was there's no income limit, and the primary dwelling, and the unit must be the primary dwelling of the occupant. Typically, it was measured in months lived in per year. In the sole existing case of this, which was in Charlevoix County, Michigan, it was 10 months a year. This program tends to be simpler to administer. It has less requirements. It requires less strenuous monitoring, but it's also less likely to tie housing prices to local wages. It is more focused on preserving the community and making sure that people who have a stake in this community have access to housing that meets their needs, and it was less concerned about impacting the direct prices. Workplace eligibility, which was by far the more common, 7 of the 8 programs that we looked at used this model. And this model, like the pure residency, no income limits, and it must be the primary dwelling of the occupant. However, it had the additional requirement that at least one occupant must work in the program area, with some exceptions, for example, if you're a retiree or if you are disabled or some other exceptions like that. And in some cases, programs would add additional requirements to kind of build up and further target those areas. The working was usually measured based in the number of average hours worked in the community or a percent of income. These programs tended to be more complex to administer. When you were reviewing your compliance, you would have to look through W-2s. You would have to establish whether the companies are actually based in that area. And it raises extra questions that you would have to answer, such as, does telecommuting count as a local worker? However, this does tie the housing prices of these units directly into local wages, because now it has to be affordable to people making a wage that you can get in that community. And so the focus on this one was less on preserving the community generally, and it was much more focused on preserving housing for your local workforce. And so this is kind of the key dichotomy between these two areas that you need to consider if you're looking at building one of these programs. Is your focus on preserving community in all of its forms, or are you focusing on preserving workforce housing? Next slide. And so the second consideration was resale price caps. There were, again, two of these programs. First was the simple deed restriction, which is no price cap. Essentially, whatever the occupant could get for reselling, that is what they could charge. And the pros of that, or the considerations for that, is it was a lower restriction cost because it's less burdensome. So you'll be able to spend less money on each deed restriction, but there's no guarantee that the unit will sell at an affordable, attainable price down the line. I know we heard from a couple of people talking about these things, concerns about essentially what happens after the first buyer. What happens after the first person reaches it? How does it continue through that? This one, there is less direct control over that from the deed restriction holder. Heavy deed restrictions, however, place an appreciation cap on resale prices. In the examples we saw, it was typically about 3%. And these have a higher restriction cost. Now you are affecting directly how much someone could sell this property for. And so they need a higher buy-in at the beginning to justify that cost for themselves. However, this does have a guaranteed price impact for both that second buyer and every subsequent buyer after that. And so, talking about one of the questions we had on there, someone had asked if there's a resale price of the property capped, and if there's a formula used to calculate the allowable price increase based on market value or inflation. This is absolutely a way that you could. However, typically the cases that we've seen were tied into a set appreciation value per year, 3% per year for every year you hold the property. And so then talking a little bit about the administration of these programs, another key policy decision that a lot of these programs made is these programs function similar to a buy-down program for home buyers. They specifically targeted people that were buying homes for the first time, and they made the conscious decision to not focus on putting deed restrictions on existing homeowners in most cases. This was when we talked to people who were administering these programs, it was usually due to a conscious decision they made that they wanted to prioritize that. They found it was more administratively easy to put the deed restriction on at the point of resale versus buying it in the beginning. There were less surprises. And this also gave them an easier time putting things in like right of first refusal, things like that. All these programs do conduct their own monitoring, usually with a designated deed restriction staffer. One thing that we heard over and over again from each of the programs we talked to is that, especially if you're doing a workforce eligibility, the monitoring on this is very, very time intensive. And because it needs to be time, and because it's time sensitive, there's a lot of focus on getting that done as quickly as possible. So there was a lot of times a part-time staffer who this was their job, or because a lot of these programs have a slew of restriction programs, they already had someone on staff whose sole job was monitoring and administering these deed restriction programs. Restrictions that we saw typically run in perpetuity, but some states, as in some cases there is in Massachusetts, do have statewide restrictions on how long you could serve these for. For example, in Montana, you can only hold a deed restriction for 70 years, and so they worked with that in that context. And enforcement typically involves working with the owner to reach compliance if someone's found to be out of compliance. If they aren't, additional remedies such as daily fines, placing a lien on the property, or in some cases, evictions did occur. And this is one thing that we heard from some of these organizations, that this program does sometimes put the administrator in a difficult position of, especially if you're looking at a workplace geography based program, you might have the hard decision of a single parent who loses their job and the only job they can find is out of the county. You might have to find yourself in the position of either fining them or forcing a sale for that type of program. And just to address a couple of questions we got on administration related issues. Someone asked, are there any incentives to motivate homeowners to place a deed restriction on their property? Typically, the pricing was the purchase price was the only incentive we saw. In our report, we actually model out some other types of incentives that you could do at the building level instead of working on the homeowner, of, you know, expedited permitting and things like that, but that doesn't really work if it's an existing unit. And then someone else asked, using existing programs as a model, the short-term move out would not, oh, I'm sorry. High level, what are the benefits, limitations, and complications? Mostly I envision issues would arise upon existing illness and or death of homeowners. How does the restriction interact with homeowners needing to move into assisted living, nursing homes, rehabs, where they might plan to move back into their home, would be out for an extended period of time? This is, again, a policy decision that would need to be made on the individual program. If it was a permanent move out, my guess is that the administrator would choose to, would have to figure out that compliance and how that would work because the occupant is no longer there. Or in the case of a death in the family and it passes to someone who doesn't want to move into the unit or doesn't want to meet those requirements, there's always the option to rent them out to an eligible household. But again, this is policy decisions that need to be considered when you're building out this program.
And when you're writing the restrictions, which is
Exactly.
So when we were looking at the language in relation to that question, because this comes up with affordable units as well, there was, you know, it's a little vague, but essentially if the property passes on, whoever is the owner of the property is bound by that restriction. And so in theory, the program administrator could, you know, pursue enforcement measures that ultimately, I assume, would lead the heir to want to sell, but the property is still bound by the restriction.
Perfect. And then talking a little about the cost and productivity that we saw from these programs. Typically, the programs we saw pay somewhere between 5% and 25% of the home's value, with 25% kind of being an outlier for the most restrictive and the most restrictive program that we saw. Depending on the restriction and eligibility. Again, these prices vary pretty widely based on how restrictive you want the program to be, what type of eligibility you're looking at, and what you could get from the market. Funded, and then second, these programs were almost entirely funded from governmental general funds and supplemented with local recreation and excise taxes. None of the programs we talked to substantially used any grants or programs such as that. These were usually funds that the communities needed to contribute from their own general funds, their own funding streams. And a lot of times these programs actually benefit from the fact that places like Colorado have a very large focus on kind of home rule for their counties and their municipalities, which gave them a lot of control over that some states might not have. In terms of actual raw productivity, the programs we studied carried anywhere between 7 and 200 units, with the lowest being Charlevoix County with just 7 units and the highest being Vale and Deed at 175 deed restricted units. It's important to note that these were both a factor of annual productivity and time. Vale and Deed is the oldest continually operating program, having existed since 2017, while a lot of these programs are significantly newer, having only emerged in 2020, 2021, 2022. And finally, a notice that we got from a lot of the communities we talked to is things like interest prices and things like that have driven up recently the amount that they've had to pay per restriction, as things like interest on mortgages has made people need to get more money in this initial payment to make it worth it on the long run for them. And then finally, just to leave everyone with a couple of the high level things that we've seen from this, and the key takeaways I think that we should take from these case studies were, like affordable housing programs, year-round deed restrictions, programs have significant cost and administrative requirements. And the critical function of this that I think we've touched on a couple of times in this is an organization must first identify its goals and design the program to fit these goals. This program has a large amount of flexibility into it of how you do it. And a lot of the answers to these to people's questions and a lot of the answers to how you want to administrate something is you need to first think about what your goal is. Are you trying to preserve the community? Are you trying to preserve workforce housing? And how much do you care about long-term affordability of the units? And those will shape the policy outcomes and the structure of the document. And most programs reviewed are part of a larger incentives that include multiple strategies for encouraging year-round housing. A lot of these programs, as I hinted at back in the administration, a lot of these programs are part of a kind of network of restriction programs that these communities oversee. And then finally, a year-round deed restriction program alone is unlikely to shift the overall housing market, but it can create a sub-market of purpose-restricted real estate that can meet program goals. So you're not going to have a serious impact on your entire town's income. This isn't going to be shifting, just in the same way that affordable housing deed restrictions don't shift the entire economy down, but it can create a subset of the market that serves the needs of people in your community.
All right, thank you, Will. So for this part of the presentation, I just want to take some of the findings that we discovered in our research and bring it into the Cape Cod context, specifically with a focus on the Lower and Outer Cape. And so we, in the report, detailed some very specific scenarios because we wanted to look at some target goal for number of restrictions. A lot of these programs, as Will mentioned, are part of larger initiatives. For example, Vail Indeed is part of a larger town initiative to restrict 1,000 units within a certain time period, with the Vail Indeed program being a part of that. So we wanted to come up with some metrics. So the report details some pretty specific scenarios, but for purposes of today, I just generally want to say what we assumed was a higher cost per restriction for a workplace eligibility model versus a residency eligibility. And I'll explain kind of our thought process on that. But essentially, the workplace eligibility, you're limiting the future resale to a smaller pool. Therefore, the owner is not likely to get, as they're going to have a smaller pool of people they can sell to. So, and then also a higher cost for the restrictions for those heavy restrictions, which have a resale price cap, versus simple restrictions, which do not have a resale price cap. So we tried to have a range of percentages according to those big considerations. And as Will said, there's no right or wrong answer. It's based on your program's goals. And so I'll talk about how the Cape Cod housing market might differ from some of the programs we looked at and how that might shape a program's goals. But we built in some administrative costs as well. And we tried to make clear in the report, these are very, very fluid assumptions, but we wanted to assume some degree of program setup in case a community or regional entity needed to procure services to just kind of develop the framework for a program. Also, when the unit is initially restricted, what that cost would look like, and then annual monitoring costs on a per unit basis, and then just some general program costs. So in the report, we do kind of, we explain some of the ranges in there, but those are just some general administrative costs that we built in. But also looking again at the regional considerations, we want to emphasize that the housing market of the Lower and Outer Cape is different than a lot of these programs. There's a much higher share of retiree households and 65 plus householders, which I think really speaks to why a lot of these communities have a workplace focus. Whereas Charlevoix, which had kind of a comparably higher percentage of households with retirement income at 33% compared to the Lower and Outer Cape at 40%. That was the one program we found that focused on really limiting it to current owners, and then also and a residency model. So it wasn't a workplace model. Because that was the need of the community. Then also looking at the housing stock, the programs we looked at have a much lower share of their units in single family detached homes, which has huge implications for per unit cost. So Vail Indeed, for example, as part of Eagle County, which has only 36% of their housing stock is in single family detached homes. It's even lower for Vail itself. So you just have more housing stock to play around with for a program. Whereas in the Lower and Outer Cape, it's about 82% of the housing stock is in single family detached homes. So there's a cost associated with there if you're talking about existing units. Another regional consideration that is going to factor into workplace eligibility is you want to kind of bring it into the context of the local wages, because those are going to be your buyers. And so compared to the surrounding counties, including Dukes and Nantucket, which I was a bit surprised by. The average wages and salaries of area jobs are lower compared to any of the surrounding counties, Bristol County, Plymouth County, Dukes and Nantucket. And then, obviously Dukes and Nantucket are an outlier when it comes to the sale prices, but compared to the median sale prices for homes, Barnstable County is more out of sync than Plymouth County and Bristol County. So those wages compared to the values, more out of sync. So it makes it harder for your workforce to be able to purchase a home. And another regional consideration, states have different legal requirements, as Will mentioned. So different states have different allowable uses for general fund expenditures. Different states have different types of local option taxes that communities can adopt, or procedures for home rule petition, and then the ability to hold perpetual deed restrictions. So I know that's always kind of a gray area where people ask, are we allowed to do this? Are we not? Can it be perpetual? Can it not? So a couple of key things, and again, this would obviously guidance would need to come from town council, but one thing is the Affordable Homes Act does provide for seasonal communities to acquire perpetual year-round deed restrictions and to establish a year-round housing trust fund. Before we send these slides out, I'm going to correct that bullet. It's to acquire year-round deed restrictions. It doesn't specify perpetual in the Affordable Homes Act, so I'll make sure to correct that. But even before the Affordable Homes Act, Chapter 184 does allow other restrictions held by any governmental body. It alleviates them from some of the limitations held by other types of restrictions, including the 30-year limit. So the Affordable Homes Act does refer to that section of Chapter 184. And then, so looking at kind of how we took all of that to look at the cost and administration, largely speaking, as I mentioned, the pure residency, lower cost per restriction compared to workplace, it's going to be higher because it's a more limited pool of buyers or renters, and with wages that are more out of sync with your housing market. And as Will mentioned, the workplace residency has a higher administrative burden because it's so much more nuanced to check where the percentage of one's income earned, where the geography is, or how many hours they worked averaged over the year. It's just a lot more burdensome than even affordable housing programs. So that's like a whole other level of monitoring that requires a lot of input. And then the resale cap, simple versus heavy, we went with a lower assumption for simple, and then higher for heavy because that has that resale price cap. We wanted to broaden what we were looking at a little bit. So we did build in a model looking at new construction. And as I mentioned, that's in part because these programs are for the biggest ones with the most amount of deed restrictions, it's not just acquiring deed restrictions on existing units. And I think that's a really big consideration. In fact, for Vail and Deed's 1,000 restricted unit target, a lot of those, the 200 number that Will referenced, that's kind of in their initial reporting for the Vail and Deed program, focusing on existing units, but they have, through permitting of new construction, deed restricted many more units. Same with Big Sky, Montana, that's a big focus. So we wanted to look at what that could, how that could play out as well. But the cost per restriction, again, looking at your housing market, it's mostly single family homes. So that's going to be a higher cost per restriction. For purposes of this study, we just looked at average assessed value, but it might be more helpful to also look at, the bottom quartile value homes, just to kind of get a better sense, a community specific sense about what your actual stock looks like. But there's going to be a higher cost for those single family properties generally than other types of units. We did actually say that the administrative burden for new construction, it's kind of a bit unknown because it's going to be more community specific. It might entail adopting new zoning, which is more challenging in some communities than others, and infrastructure considerations. With regard to adopting the zoning, I know Cape Cod Commission's model bylaw, they have an incentive bylaw for restricting year-round units in new construction, similar to an inclusionary zoning for affordability purposes. So we wanted to stay kind of moderate there for administrative because it really depends on the communities, how challenging it's going to be to bring that into permitting and zoning. But this actually differs a teeny tiny bit from the report because I consolidated it a lot. I wanted to just focus for purposes of this slide on estimated cost per restricted unit. And we brought it down here to 5%. And so when you're looking at existing single family homes. This is based on an average of the assessed values of the communities. The report details our methodology on that. But you'd be looking at, if you're going with a 5% restriction, which might be residency, and a simple restriction that doesn't have a resale cap, that's going to be most likely a lower cost. If you go up to the very higher end that we saw in at least one program of 25%, it's getting much higher, of course. That said, a lot of the programs had a maximum per restriction cost, 150,000, 200,000. So it'd be unlikely that a program would get that high anyway on a particular unit. And then condos, lower cost for average assessed value by and large. And so that's going to result in a lower restriction cost. Another model we wanted to look at was, what if you restrict 2-family properties? You might require owner occupancy in one unit, you might not. Decision is up to the program, but just because you're now getting 2 restricted units, that is lowering the cost even more. And again, that range, that 5 to 25% based on whether it's workplace or residency, simple or heavy restriction. And then, as I mentioned, we wanted to look at a new development zoning incentive. It could vary the unit type. I think the examples we saw were largely rental. That doesn't mean it would have to be. In theory, there could be a restriction on an ownership project, but the examples we saw were rental by and large. And it's more difficult to estimate the cost per restricted unit because it's handled through permitting. And so it's an incentive that it just as the way inclusionary zoning is. So it's going to be really kind of market specific how the community chooses to build those incentives. We also wanted to look at projects that are a kind of total different view, which is looking at the local subsidy put into permitted projects through the 40B process. And because those units naturally are going to be restricted year round anyway, with there being an income component. And so we just took a recent example for Lawrence Hill and Wellfleet, specifically looking at the local subsidy, not the entire project cost, but the local subsidy by multiple towns put into the project amounted to about $43,000 for the number of units created. So lower cost than some of the other models, but not all of them. So, but again, that's going to be very specific to a project's kind of overall costs, and it would be very different from one community to the next, but it's just going to be kind of handled in a different approach because it's through new construction. So lastly, just to zip through some final policy considerations for you. Obviously, we know cost. There's no right or wrong answer with how much a community wants to spend or if they want to do something like this, but most likely communities, you're going to have some sort of fixed budget, limited funding sources. So you are going to want to look at things like costs. And that's why it's helpful to have an understanding of per unit restrictions based on the context of your local market. So you might want to look at ways to limit costs and focus funds. Maybe you're focusing on condominiums or smaller multifamily or older units, whatever it may be, if you want to focus on existing units, or you want to pair it with incentives for new construction. Zoning incentives, they do offer unquestionably a lower cost option per restricted unit, but there's challenges there too because they require zoning changes. Communities we heard this from developers during the consultation process, different infrastructure from one community to the next. So that's going to impact how much density you can achieve through zoning. And so that's definitely a consideration. Cape Cod Commission does have a model bylaw towns can review for guidance. Another big consideration we wanted to speak to was just kind of the equity. How can the community ensure that these year-round restriction programs is fair and open to potentially eligible participants? So affordable housing programs have a lot of safeguards with marketing, resident selection, really to ensure that communities are taking big steps to affirmatively further fair housing with public funds. And so what things can the community do to make sure that there's an equitable process, what can the community do for marketing? What would the equivalent be to an affirmative fair housing marketing plan that the community could really feel confident about saying, yes, we are ensuring that equity is a consideration. Also, if it is an employment focused program, affirmative HR hiring policies can help. since it's paired with employment. And then in addition to consulting with town council, we would say consult with a fair housing attorney. You know, town council is going to have a very general, important perspective, but towns or programs can go further and specifically consult with a fair housing attorney to identify any potential concerns there. And then for just general policy, we can't answer if the outcome justifies the cost, because it's totally dependent on local and regional goals. So it is going to help create a submarket, but who that submarket is serving and how much per restriction, things like that, that's all going to be dependent on program goals. And then, so just kind of referring back to this, any program is going to need to consider your housing market. You have a lot more single family homes if you're looking at existing units. And so those are higher cost. Also, how does that relate to local wages if you're looking at a workforce model? Most likely, you're going to have to pay more for the restriction because the wages are not comparable to the housing market. What existing resources do you have? There's a heavy need for monitoring. I know from our work with many communities that even monitoring affordable units is a challenge. So adding another type of monitoring is just something to be aware of. Make sure that you have planned accordingly. And who are those target beneficiaries? We mentioned Charlevoix was a bit different than the other ones because it was the only example of a simple residency, not a workplace model, which made sense because it was, you know, more retiree households, whereas the other programs, a lot of them were really focused on, we want to create workforce housing. So again, no right or wrong answer, just consider the cost per restriction and how much administrative capacity you have. So I know that if there were really great questions that if Will or I didn't speak to, I was so excitedly looking at the slides that if I neglected to answer any questions, now is a great time. But we also will be, we're going to work with Andrea to any of the questions that were submitted or that we can't answer today. If someone has a question we need to do a little more research on, we want to just prepare kind of a response document with CDP to make sure that you get those answers. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and Andrea, how we want to open it up.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. That was a ton of information. Thank you, Chloe and Will and Alexis. If folks haven't had a chance to dive into the report itself, it is also a ton of information and really, frankly, excellent data for the region, in addition to the analysis on the utility of deed restrictions. I want folks to be aware that about 15 town officials and town staff participated in both the design of this study and also in editing and reviewing the draft before it was distributed, and overwhelming feedback has been that it's been really helpful. That was our goal. Our goal is not to sway towns on whether they should be implementing this, but to provide you with a decision-making tool that would be helpful. With that said, you know, the CDP's lens is we want to make sure that our region is building, you know, the hundreds of units that we need to support people who are currently in need of housing. And so we strongly, strongly encourage towns in the Lower and Outer Cape to weigh the impact against the costs of implementing such a program, and of course, administering a program. And so if you look in the report, you'll see a memo from the CDP to that effect with a little bit more detail. Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. And if anyone wants to raise their hand, we can kind of field between the two. We have 15 minutes for questions. So the first one I see, and this will be whoever can pick it up, Alexis, Will, or Chloe, just jump in. The first one I see is, why don't any of these models address commercial property owners and their availability to access these programs? Mostly every new build commercial has a mixed use model.
So that's a great question. And if I'm understanding correctly, please let me know, Joseph, if I'm not. But some of the programs do specifically, if they limit the ability to rent a deed restricted property, because some do, they have exceptions for eligible employers. They are able to, so when you're talking about commercial property owners, are you speaking to like business owners for their workforce, or something more broadly? And
Joe, I see you're still here if you want to speak for yourself. My assumption is it's there's like top of shop housing situation, if they can just put a restriction on that particular unit, but oh,
No,
here he is.
it's just business owners I'm asking about. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so what would their motivation be to, who would they be wanting to restrict the units for?
It's multiple. I mean, year round. I mean, I have friends of mine that own restaurants down here that, are buying up these hotels and motels all over the place, and not getting any incentive for it to speak of. And then when the season's over, they're trying to rent on the off season, which is a bit of a pain and hard to do. That's just one example, but it's just a lot of commercial, just a lot of business commercial people that are trying to rent the mixed use piece of residential, where they live. So
Yeah.
there are people that own these businesses that do mixed use that don't want to sell it as a condo for $1 million. So I know because I've been researching it. So there's a lot of people that want to help out with affordable housing. So long as they're getting paid, it's meeting their need annually, they're fine with it.
So I will say, and then I see Jay has a comment as well. I think because this program is focusing on year-round occupancy, I think a program of this nature would absolutely would and should partner with the business community. And so some of the programs that we researched did allow only eligible employers, qualified employers, however the program defines it, to acquire, for example, motels or something else, and to rent them, lease them to their employees. So that is a part of these programs, and they do receive a financial incentive for doing so.
Okay.
For the seasonal workers, I mean, that would just be a different program, different necessary purpose. It just, because this is focused on the year-round workforce, that I will say that absolutely could and should be looked at.
And the other thing is, like, if you look at the Mass Act that just got passed by the governor, I didn't see it, but it might be in there somewhere deep in. I didn't see them. It's all seems to be single units, which is just taking up more green space. And these people are, most of the time, businesses are in an area where services can be utilized by the people that are renting from them, et cetera, et cetera. I just didn't see them touching it all in the state level. I tried to get a hold of people up there, but they didn't call me back. So
yeah, I think with the different types of units that the program would focus on, in just as for affordable units, I mean, it is more cost effective on a per unit basis to not focus on those single family homes, whether you're talking about new construction or existing units. So I think, again, there's no right or wrong answer, depends on the program goals. But I think if a program is trying to maximize how it is utilizing what most likely would be limited funds, not limiting it to single family, it is a little bit of a challenge because that's most of the units in the region. But I think that can be definitely a consideration, that you're going to get more bang for your buck with other types of buildings.
okay, thank you.
Alexis, I would just like reiterate your comment there. I think we have to be really strategic. We've got a huge need. We have limited resources, and we also are looking at a future that is very unknown in terms of what resources are going to be available. And so, for me, the big takeaway of this study is this is not the most strategic, effective way to address our housing challenges here, both because of our housing stock being 90% plus is single family houses, and the cost of deed restrictions on single family houses is just absolutely out of sight. And then I think, Joe, just kind of your point and your concern around housing for seasonal workers. I think we need to be very thoughtful about is that we're going to be making investment of public dollars for to basically subsidize low wage businesses is what we're talking about here. And I think I would be, as an advocate, I would want us using municipal dollars for year-round housing and not for seasonal workforce housing. There are lots of things that municipalities can do to support businesses through, permitting and zoning and access to wastewater capacity, to build housing for seasonal workers. But I think given the challenges that we're facing with a year-round community, the emphasis really needs to be on using public resources for year-round housing for people who are going to live and work year-round in our communities.
All right, thank you. Lewis, did I hear someone?
Excuse me, you go ahead.
Oh yeah, go ahead. You gonna take the next question?
Yeah, do you want me to just go down the chat?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Sure. So there was a question about who has responsibility for upkeep, repairs, improvements. Normally it would be the homeowner. So that is going to be specified in the restriction itself. I do know that some of the programs, for example, might place a lien on the property prior to resale, so that there'd be some sort of appraisal process when the occupant wants to sell the property. If we're talking about owner occupied, I know I keep saying occupant, assuming it's owner, but many of these programs do allow for renters as well. But either way, before the property is conveyed to the next owner, whether it be a landlord or an owner occupant of a unit, there's usually an appraisal process, and some restrictions that we looked at do specify that, if there's a need for some, minimal level of upkeep to get the property suitable for the next occupant, that would be a lien would be placed on the property accordingly. That's a really good question that makes me want to look closer at existing affordable restrictions and what they say, because I imagine it would be a similar approach. That, when an SHI ownership unit, for example, is getting ready for resale, there's some, inspection of the property before to make sure that it's, ready for the next buyer. So just, if I answer a question but don't fully answer it, if you want to, you can raise your hand or put in the chat if you have more to that question. So I think that the second half, what does the program administration play in assuring the property remains livable and desirable? So I think that also would be really a good place to make sure that whatever language is in the restriction itself does allow for, as part of the monitoring, inspection of the property as needed. I believe the model restrictions we looked at do account for that. And then again, if there's a need for some repair or something and the owner is not complying, that there might be a lien placed on the property that would address that during resale. That's the only measure that I would be able to think of.
And then as far as deed restricting mobile homes where land is not owned?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question, because we heard from, this is one of the reasons that, as Will mentioned, a lot of the programs, even if they originally were open to restricting units that are currently occupied as opposed to at resale, some of those sneaky little, challenges that we heard one program administrator say, like, I don't know how the homeowners associations haven't, no one's complained, but it's interesting because they're placing restrictions on properties that are part of some other larger association, or in the case of like a mobile home park where there's land that's owned by the park itself. So there are, I imagine it would be similar to, for example, a lot of the units that are restricted are condominium units. And so I think it's just in the language of the restriction, if there's a need for subordination to another agreement or right of first refusal, all that's going to be kind of nuanced. And that's precisely why I think a lot of the programs prefer addressing it at resale, but it's not limited to that. It's just that whoever else is on a restriction relating to the property would need to agree to a new restriction being placed on it if it, limited occupancy to year round. So I didn't see any examples specifically to mobile homes, but other similar types of there being a homeowners association or condominium association, some other entity that the home itself is a part of, it would likely just come into play there. That's a really great question, though. I don't think, Will, we saw any examples of mobile homes in particular, but I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't think we did either. I think that there could be some discussion in that if this was to materialize on whether or not the deed restriction would be placed on the underlying land or on the individual units, individual mobile homes, in that way. But yeah, and this gives me a side into, there were a couple of questions we got up front about ownership versus rental of some of these units. And so I just wanted to use this to piggyback a little bit off of the idea of a lot of these deed restrictions went to great lengths to use the term occupant and not homeowner.
Yes.
And so to stress that idea of, there is some flexibility in these programs of for renting or for situations like this where the land is not owned by the person living in the unit.
Right.
And typically what they said whoever the occupant is, you have to meet the requirements and the eligibility.
Can we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Are there any funds or other help towards rehabbing existing homes? And the example is converting a single family house into 4 units that could be used in conjunction.
So a challenge with that, I think, would be a lot of the existing funds that are currently available until the Affordable Homes Act, has provided for a year-round, allowed for communities to establish a year-round fund. But a lot of the housing-related programs are tied to income. So, for example, if a community's affordable housing trust or with CPA funds or something wanted to offer such a program, there would be an income limit placed. Whether a community through special legislation or, there are all sorts of really creative examples of how communities through special legislation have established other types of housing funds that maybe could assist with that. But otherwise, I assume it would be tied to income unless through the Affordable Homes Act seasonal community designation with the provision that would allow communities to do that. And that said, I think that would be where there's room for negotiation. A lot of the programs that stress that, the funds can be used for down payment assistance if it's, or it can be used for rehabilitation of a unit. So those sorts of things are that where there's negotiation between the program and the person who would like to have a restriction placed on the property. They could specify that it's going to be rehabbed. That's a great question.
I just wanted to pause here and say that I'm noting that we're about to end the session. We do have another question, which I think we can get to, but if folks feel like they need to leave because we're approaching noon, I totally understand that. And if you want to stick around for a few more questions, that's great. So the last question that I have here in the chat is, so one of the other programs that has been suggested for the Cape, considering our predominance of older single-family homeowners, was a voluntary home matching program. Was there any consideration of public or nonprofit programs that provide incentives and technical support to encourage existing owners to rent or sell to buyers or renters who qualify as essential workers? And then there's a suggestion there.
I mean, I haven't seen any examples that specifically are incentivizing that type of arrangement. I mean, I don't see why it couldn't be developed, but I mean, I will say that in a lot of the programs, all of the programs we looked at are newer. And one thing that we heard time and again was, it's like trying to build a plane as you're trying to fly it, and there's changes and, you realize something isn't working. And so I would suggest starting simpler. And so I think like a program like that sounds fantastic. It's just, I think for a program to get its bearings, just in the most basic sense, before tackling something like that. But I think that's a really, really interesting idea. And that reminds me of the Charlevoix example. In lieu of a payment to the owner, there was an example where instead they have a real estate transfer tax that gets assessed, and so that was waived in exchange for putting the restriction on. So I'm wondering if, as an incentive, as you're mentioning, if something like that could be paired with the program. But I would not start because it's so complex to launch a new program to begin with. Yeah. Andrea, there is one more question that I'm embarrassed I didn't connect to. It would have tied into my slides, if I may, and then
please.
Sure.
We're clearly all interested in learning more.
Yeah, so Warren Chain from the Chatham Planning Board, he doesn't look like he's on this call, but he had a really great question about if this is going to be built into zoning, having, density bonuses and whatnot. But then he asked, what would the mechanism be for, you know, deed restriction? Is it conditions of a special permit? So on and so forth. I will say, whatever you do, I've seen this from lessons learned from affordable housing programs. You want there to be some sort of regulatory agreement that gets filed with the registry. And I believe the model bylaw language says, you know, shall be recorded with the registry, but you don't just want it to be in the conditions of the special permit floating around, not attached to the actual deed, because that is how things fall off and get lost and are no longer followed. So the language should really specifically specify whether through, you know, a regulatory agreement or something that gets attached to and referenced in the deed, that it follows along every, you know, forever and ever. So that would be, I would suggest, I don't know if anyone from Chatham is on the call, but just making sure that the bylaw includes some sort of provision for that, that it's recorded, affixed to the deed, and so on and so forth, not just condition of special permit. That's all.
Thank you so much for addressing that. Okay, so if some of you are late processors of information that don't really come up with questions in the moment, like me, I'm happy to accept questions to the end of the day tomorrow, Wednesday, February 26th, and then I'll work with Chloe, Will, and Alexis to get some written responses to you as soon as we possibly can. Thank you all so much for your interest and your participation. We hope this is helpful, and join us for the next Housing Institute workshop.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.